Next speaker is Annie Collins. Annie Collins is an undergraduate. You're not going to believe it when you see her talk. But another one that just blew me away when I saw the quality of her work, and just has continued doing amazing work in this research project. I think that I've been describing Annie as a DOS, Department of Statistical Sciences student, but I actually think you might be a maths student who's masquerading in DOS. And so we welcome and would love to have you here as much as possible, or perhaps more permanently if we can manage it. Annie is going to look at the role of preprint repositories. They've become obviously very important in sciences, and especially important in the past year with COVID and the need and importance for sharing research quickly. The issue is that, well, the good thing about them is that anybody can contribute, and the issue is that anybody can contribute. And so putting in place norms around sharing of code, sharing of data is quite important. And yeah, so thanks very much, Annie. Very much looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you for the intro. I'm going to share my screen. I'm with Monica on the struggle still. Can you see that?
Yeah, that's perfect.
And can you see my cursor as well?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So hi everybody, thank you so much for being here today. Like Rohan mentioned, my name's Annie and I'm an undergrad at the University of Toronto. I am a math student, so I am a little spy in the Department of Statistical Sciences. Today I will be discussing the reproducibility of medRxiv preprints, specifically those that relate to COVID research, so those from the past year. And this work is part of a paper that Rohan and I are in the process of co-authoring. So before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge Kanzi, Ontario and Monica Alexander for their financial support in making this project happen. And I'll begin with an overview. So this is sort of an extension of work done by Weisgerber et al., who performed a review of COVID-related preprints posted up to mid-July last year. And they screened for markers of transparency and reproducibility fairly broadly. So this included open data and code, amongst several other features. So we don't directly reproduce this study, but we did use a similar methodology specifically for the open data and code processes that they used. And we use this for COVID-19 related medRxiv preprints posted between January 2020 and January 2021. So this is an extension on the original timeframe as well. Our overall main finding was that less than 20% of preprints that we analyzed contained markers of open data or open code. And then we extended this a little bit by looking into the date a preprint was posted, whether or not the preprint was eventually peer reviewed and published, and some specific types of papers to see how these factors might influence or be influenced by the presence of open data or open code in the preprint. If you don't know what preprints and medRxiv are, I'm going to explain that in a bit, so don't worry about that. So the data collection process was quite a journey. I'll start off by giving some context into what medRxiv and preprints are. So medRxiv is a biomedical specific preprint repository. For some of you who may be more familiar with arXiv, from a stats perspective, it's a biomedical specific version of arXiv essentially. So it's a server where health and biomedical researchers can post their manuscripts prior to peer review. So since they don't have to undergo peer review, it's a quick way to make research available to the scientific community and also to the general public. But it also means that, like Rohan said, anyone can post. So the research may contain errors and hasn't been reviewed or endorsed by any specific journal or any members of the scientific community yet. And I'm going to touch on this more later, but preprints and specifically medRxiv as a server have become really, really important in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. And this is due to the speed at which information can be disseminated. And so just some figures on this topic, it's estimated that between 17 and 30% of all COVID papers that were published in 2020 were published in preprint form. And that 24% of these preprints were posted to medRxiv alone, which is more than any other preprint server. So this is why we chose to focus on medRxiv, at least in this initial study, due to its significance in this context. So beginning off with our frame and sampling. So we used R for our analysis, specifically the package medRxiv, which is written on the screen. And the first step is to create a copy of the medRxiv server from the API. So this R package is set up to work with the medRxiv API. And this essentially creates a copy of every paper or preprint that's been posted to medRxiv, and with information like title and abstract and authors and things like that. And we then filtered this for COVID-related research, and we came up with 9,929, so nearly 10,000 preprints posted between January 2020 and 2021. And then we sampled the COVID preprints for a sample size of 1,200, so just over 10%. And this formed the basis for our text analysis. So these are the papers that we analyzed. And for our analysis, we used the open data detection in publications text mining algorithm. So this is an algorithm that exists already. We didn't write it or anything. And there's an R package by the same name that's set up to work with this. So ODDpub. And this is a text mining algorithm, which basically uses a bunch of keyword searches and combinations of keywords to scan text for indicators that a paper contains open data or open code. And it's specifically useful in this context because it's tailored to biomedical papers, since it's set up to detect references to specific biomedical data repositories. So it gets a little bit more specific than just something like GitHub, and it's tailored to the biomedical field, which is important for medRxiv papers. So the workflow for this was to download the sampled preprints as PDFs, then to convert these PDFs to text files, and then to run them through the ODDpub algorithm to check for open data and open code markers. And so the output of this step here is basically a table that included the name of the text file, which included as a substring the DOI of the preprint. So that was important for linking the two data sets together. And then basically what you had was a true or false indicator for whether or not that text file contained indicators of open data or indicators of open code. And then if it did contain open data or open code indicators, it would include the specific portion of the text that it detected for that. So that sounds a bit complicated, but basically it's a true or false for open data or open code. And then we were able to link that via DOI to the sample that we had of medRxiv data from the API. So this is how we were able to link the factors of like date posted and things like that because of the data that was extracted at this step, along with the output of the ODDpub algorithm. So an initial look at our data, we see, so this is all of the COVID-19 preprints that were posted to medRxiv in 2020 and January 2021. So basically what you see is this giant increase in the amount of papers that were posted between January and May 2020. If you remember what was going on in early 2020, you might remember that there was a pandemic taking off globally. And for context, in March, and about mid-March was when the World Health Organization declared COVID pandemic. So it actually became a pandemic in March. And at this point, the epicenter was in Europe, but it was still pretty prevalent in East Asia. And for those of us in Ontario, this is when a lot of our public health measures started to come into effect with university closures and lockdowns, stuff like that. So it makes it obvious why there was this big output of research between that time, peaking in May, and then it's sort of decreased since then, remained fairly stable in the latter half of 2020, fluctuating around 750 preprints posted per month. And on the right here, we have our sampled preprints. So you can see the distribution follows fairly similarly from the overall server, which is good. We randomly sampled, so we would expect this. And down here, you can see the proportion of, or the number of papers that have open data, open code, or both. And you can sort of see that it follows a relatively similar distribution as well, but we'll look into that a bit further in a few slides. And so this is just an overall summary of what we found. So this top row here is papers that contained neither open data nor open code markers. And you can see that that's about just over 80% of the preprints that we looked at. And then the remaining preprints, the remaining 19% of preprints were broken down with 4% having only open code markers, 8% having only open data markers, and 7% having both open data and open code markers. So now if we look at how open data and code availability has changed over time, this graph on the left is what we just looked at as far as our sample. And then this graph on the right is the proportion of preprints posted that had open data or open code indicators in their text. And so right off the bat, you can see that it fluctuates a lot over the course of the year. Open code especially has been quite up and down. But what you might notice from this is that there hasn't really been much of an overall trend in the either improvement or decline in availability of open data or code. And you also see that there doesn't seem to be much influence over the number of preprints that was posted in any given month over the proportion of preprints that were posted. So that might be a concern because in the rush to publish, maybe in May when everyone was posting to medRxiv, maybe there were some steps skipped and you didn't want to share your coder data. That doesn't appear to be the case because this seems to be fairly randomly fluctuating. And one thing I'll just point out on this graph is that in January 2020, we have this 0 here. Our sample contained only one preprint from January 2020, and it didn't have open data or code. So this is a fairly significant outlier, which is why we're not too focused on this big increase between January and February. So just thought I'd point that out. Now, if we look at publication status, so the medRxiv API data contains a DOI of a published paper if it has been detected by medRxiv that a preprint has gone on to be published. So that's how we were able to identify papers that have subsequently been, or preprints that have subsequently been published. So here we can see that just over, so this is just over 250 preprints in our sample indicate that they've been published. This is about just over 1/5 of our whole sample. And over on the table on the right, table 2, we can see that papers that haven't been published have about 20% of them have open data or open code, and papers that have been published, about 15% of them have open data or open code. So it's about a 5% difference, keeping in mind that the overall sample was at 19% with open data or open code. So this does start to, it's not a huge difference, but it starts to raise some concerns over potential publication bias, where peer reviewers might favor papers with novel results over those with less novel results, but more open science or more transparency or reproducibility. So that's sort of what we might be starting to see here, but we're also going to be exploring this through some modeling later. And then just something to point out is that in our data, there's going to be a publication delay because it's estimated about 60 days between preprint status and peer review and subsequent publication right now. So some of the papers that we sampled for January and December, it's possible that those have been published and that's not reflected in our data, or that they will be published, which we just can't really time travel to account for. So that's important to note, but it's also important to note that there might be some false positives in our data. It's sort of unclear how medRxiv identifies when papers have been published, but in the literature I found seems to be by string matching the title to titles in journals, which obviously might not be completely accurate. So there may be some papers that in our sample are showing up as unpublished, but actually have been published and just haven't been detected by the medRxiv API. And finally, breaking it down by preprint type, we wanted to look at differences in specific types of preprint and their relation to how available open data or code was. We chose machine learning, modeling, and simulation. Since these are fairly computational, we thought that there might be higher availability of open data and code in these types of papers. And specifically modeling and simulation papers have been fairly significant and high profile, some of them in the context of the pandemic. So you can see that machine learning papers, 38% of them showed markers of open data or code. This is double the proportion of the general sample. However, it's just 21 papers that mentioned machine learning in a sample of 1,200. So we didn't focus too much on this result. It doesn't seem to be super significant, like in the context of all of the medRxiv preprints posted. However, the modeling and simulation papers, the papers that mentioned modeling, there was over 400 of them. Simulation, less than 100, but still in the context of the pandemic, they've been important. So focusing on those, we see that 24% of modeling papers came up as having open data or open code markers, and 22% of simulation papers came up as having open data or open code markers. And this is only, again, the general sample was about 19%. So these are only very slightly higher than the general sample, which I found a little bit surprising. I figured that they might have higher availability of data and code just because of the nature of modeling and simulation papers, and also just because these have been very, very important research results. They have had influence over policy and general public opinion towards the pandemic. But sadly, there is, it's just about 5% higher for modeling papers and about 3% higher for simulation papers. So then we conducted some modeling. We used generalized linear model using the GLM function in R. So this is a little bit confusing because there's actually 4 models, 2 equations for 4 models because we separated by open data and code. But we basically looked at open data or code as a function of date that the preprint was posted, as well as publication status as a function of whether or not a preprint contained open data or code. And the results of our model are here. So like, again, this is kind of confusing because open data and code switch between independent and dependent. But basically these results here look at how date influences open data and code. And we see that these are fairly, like they're insignificant coefficients at 0.1, and they're also relatively small. So this sort of reinforces what we saw from the initial graph, that there hasn't been any very significant trend in open data or code availability throughout the pandemic. So it's neither increasing nor decreasing in a significant way over time. And then if we look over here, publication status as a function of open data, again, has an insignificant coefficient here. So not a lot of indicator of the influence of open data on whether a preprint is subsequently published. And then we have open data or open code and its influence on publication. So this coefficient is significant at a level of 0.05. From this, we didn't draw too many conclusions about open code directly influencing publication. You can see we didn't control for any other variables, but it's likely that there is some publication bias that comes into play here. For example, a lot of computational studies, there's been sort of different opinions on computational and simulation-based studies throughout the pandemic. So sometimes they might be favorable in terms of making predictions, but other times, for example, medRxiv won't publish any purely computational preprints right now because they don't depend on any like real data a lot of the time, and that can be dangerous in a preprint setting where there's a lack of peer review. So it's unlikely that there is a direct correlation between open code and publication, but it's still important to note that there is a significant coefficient there. So moving on to the discussion, I sort of want to contextualize this in the broader context of science within the pandemic and how the pandemic has impacted scientific output over the past year. So I've mentioned a lot of these points briefly before, but basically there's been many fundamental shifts in the scientific research landscape over the past year. And so that includes an increase in the speed and overall volume of research output, but also a shift in the potential consequences of bad research or just any particular piece of research due to the fact that things are moving so quickly. And policy needs to rely on a lot of this research. And so there's potential for any individual piece of research to have quite a wide impact, more so than previously or in other fields. And so in this context, it's very important that the standards of high quality, transparent and reproducible research don't suffer when the output increases and the demand increases. So this applies to all research, but as I previously mentioned, it's really important to pay attention to preprints in this context because of the lack of peer review, but also because of how significant of a role they're playing in the amount that's output and accessed through preprint servers, including medRxiv. And due to these factors, the scientific community has broadly seen an uptake in some open science practices, with COVID-19 open data repositories being created, more so for public health data. There's quite a large one maintained by the Center for Systems Science and Engineering at Johns Hopkins, which amalgamates a bunch of public health data from around the globe, even down to like the state and province level for North America. And we've also seen quite a few journals removing paywalls from their COVID-19 research specifically in order to increase accessibility to the public and also the broader scientific community. So with all that being said, it's a bit disheartening that less than 20% of the preprints we screened contained markers of open data or code. We would hope that it might be higher, particularly for some of the variables we looked at, like the papers that have been published, as well as for the modeling and simulation-based papers. So we would hope that, again, a high standard of open data is maintained across all of those variables, but also overall higher than 20%. However, one important factor that I've sort of left out intentionally up until this point is the fact that type of data that's being used in a lot of this research plays a fairly influential role. So while public health data has become a lot more accessible and a lot more used, a lot of research in the biomedical field, which relates to medRxiv and the preprints that are posted on medRxiv, may rely on private or patient level data, such as electronic health records out of the US or equivalents elsewhere. And this cannot be shared due to legal and ethical privacy reasons. So that sort of helps to mitigate our expectations of how much data might be able to be shared in this context, due to the fact that a lot of it that's being used to produce research just can't be shared for a variety of privacy reasons. So that's very important to note for the context of our research. And then I just wanted to provide some real life motivation with a couple of examples that have come up in the past year. So I've talked quite a bit about why open data and code, why we might want them, but here are some examples of like where they actually came into play in a big way. So I've touched on like publication bias quite a bit. And what that means is that peer reviewers and journals might favor novel COVID related results, even in cases where there's a low level of transparency and reproducibility, if that's a result that might garner a lot of attention. So we actually saw this play out last year in June. There were two papers, one published in The Lancet and one published in the New England Journal of Medicine, so fairly high profile journals. And these were papers that focus on pharmaceutical interventions for COVID-19. And these papers were brought into question, the underlying methodology was brought into question by an independent reviewer. However, the independent reviewer could not gain access to the underlying data set for either. It was a proprietary data set that included EHR data, and it was from a US company that would not release the data to an independent auditor. So this is important because these types of papers have potential to impact, and also in this case did highly impact clinical research at the time, but they couldn't be verified and ultimately were retracted from, both papers were retracted from the journals that they were published in. So this really emphasizes the need for open data in this type of research and the potential implications of non-reproducible science. And then the second example is one that you maybe might be more familiar with. So there's quite a few high profile models that came out in the earlier stages of the pandemic last year. One of them was from Imperial College. Well, there was several, but the two I'm going to focus on are one from Imperial College London in the UK, and then there was one out of the Institute for Evaluation or Health Metrics and Evaluation, which is out of the University of Washington in the US. Both were initially posted as preprints, not necessarily to medRxiv, I don't think, but definitely both were posted as preprints. And both of them ended up being very, very influential in the early days of the pandemic in terms of advising policy. So the ICL model was focused on a European, but specifically UK context, and the IHME model ended up being fairly influential for US policy. Both of these papers had open data and open code, which is great. That's the standard that we love to see. But an independent review found that only the ICL paper was reproducible, and the IHME's paper's underlying methodology was vague enough that they couldn't reproduce the model's projections. So this is one of the reasons it's so important to have open data and open code where possible, specifically in modeling papers, because we always need to be able to verify to the best of our ability the papers that can become really, really influential really quickly and find themselves having influence over even policy and things like lockdown and business closure measures. But this also brings up a really important point that I sort of wanted to end on. And I think Wijdan also talked about this earlier, but that's that having open data and code does not ever guarantee that a preprint or even a published paper is high quality and replicable, which I would argue is all the more reason to make it freely available so that papers can always be further scrutinized, especially in the context of COVID-19. So I see them coming up on the end here, but I'll just quickly go over some next steps. We want to extend this to bioRxiv and arXiv. The code we use should work on bioRxiv as well. It's set up to work with the bioRxiv API. And then we also want to increase the sample size for medRxiv and continue this analysis to take in more papers over time. So we've had a full month of preprints posted since our analysis, which ended at January 31st. And then in the more distant future, we want to look at potential geographic influence over open data and code availability. Obviously, the geographic center of the pandemic has shifted over time, and this would influence the major research output, centers of major research output at the time, particularly looking at China and East Asia as the initial sort of drivers of research towards COVID, and then research out of Europe and subsequently the US. So yeah, that's the conclusion of my presentation. I want to thank again Kenzie Ontario and Monica Alexander for their support, and also Rohan for his support in being my collaborator throughout this process, as well as a final thank you to Professor Jesse Gronswell, who provided quite a bit of help early on in this process. So I'd be happy to take any questions now, as well as my emails on the screen. So I'll be happy to field any questions there or in the Slack as well.
Thanks, Annie. That was just wonderful, as always. From the Slack, Yambo asks, do you have an idea of how the distribution of open code and data availability looks for medRxiv overall within the same time frame, not just for COVID papers?
That's a really fair. Oh, did you want to go? Oh, okay. So we looked at specifically COVID related papers, and this obviously for the implications of COVID research, but also because they represent like a very high proportion of all of the papers that were on medRxiv in this time frame. So medRxiv as a server took off quite a bit during the pandemic. It only started in June 2019, I believe. So most of its use has been for COVID papers. It would be definitely useful to check the overall distribution for like papers generally, but it would be a smaller sample size, or even we might be able to survey like the whole thing because it's very, very focused around COVID right now. So yeah, so that's potentially a future step, but to provide some context, it's very COVID heavy right
now. And Yambo also asks multiple versions of the same paper. How did you deal with that?
Yeah, so the medRxiv API output sort of filtered for that already. So it did include version numbers, and only the highest version was included. And so that obviously extended to our sample, which drew from that original data, and then to our analysis. So it was sort of, we didn't have to account for that, which is great.
Does anyone else have any other questions for Annie? Yambo asks, do you think there might be some bias in the older papers?
Which might have.
Just because they've had a chance to update and come back and.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Yeah, I guess that would have to be something we would look further into. I guess you would hope that people would post their data and code right away, but I'm guessing that's not always the case. Like I mentioned, there's quite a few factors that we didn't account or control for, so that would be another one to sort of add to the list. This was quite an introductory study and mostly a data exploration.
Are there any other questions for Annie? Oh, in the Slack, Muntasar asks, have you looked at whether putting papers on medRxiv affects publication chances at peer-reviewed journals?
Just in general? I would guess, we haven't looked at that specifically, but I would guess that in the context of COVID, just because of the amount that are being posted to preprint servers, that would have a fairly high, it would increase the chances, just because that's kind of how science has been working for COVID research in the past year. That's a good point, though. I don't know if Rohan, you have any thoughts on that.
Oh, I might just say thank you once again for a fantastic presentation, Annie. Unlike most of the, faculty and things that got to present here, Annie also, and Wishdan also had the pressures of tests and assignments and things happening this week. And so just a fantastic job by both of you under very difficult circumstances.